Sometimes the scariest unsolved cases can happen in your own mind, like being tormented by disturbing thoughts you don't want, can't control, and can't stop replaying. These thoughts can feel so real and so threatening that you actually start behaving in life-altering ways just because you're so desperate to make the distress go away and calm your mind. You might start avoiding the people that you love the most, spend hours every day trying to figure out why you're having these thoughts, or seek reassurance from everyone that you're not a bad person. If this sounds familiar to you, then you might be experiencing OCD, and you're not alone because I have it too. NoCD is the world's leading provider of OCD treatment. All of their licensed therapists truly understand OCD and specialize in treating with ERP. NoCD therapists are trained by world-renowned experts in OCD, so they know how to help you take the power away from intrusive thoughts and live the life you want to live. Therapy with NoCD is 100% virtual, covered by insurance for over 155 million Americans, and includes support between sessions, so you're never facing OCD alone. To learn more about starting OCD therapy with NoCD, go to nocd.com and book a free call to learn more about how they can help. That's nocd.com. Hello everyone, what is up? Welcome back to another episode of Killer Instinct, you guys. Thank you so much for joining me here today. If you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah and I am your host of Killer Instinct. And before we get started, make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button. That way you never miss an episode. We post weekly here on the podcast every single Wednesday. You are not going to want to miss it. We also upload the video version onto YouTube on Wednesdays as well, so make sure you are subscribed. And I know I announce that every single week, but I do want you guys to just take a moment and make sure you're subscribed wherever you are listening. I have had some people comment saying that they have been unsubscribed to the podcast, or they thought they were subscribed and now they're no longer subscribed. So if you would like to subscribe, or if you already thought you were, just take a second and double check. If you're looking for more exclusive Killer Instinct content, you can also find that over on our Patreon. We post an additional 3 episodes a week over there, as well as end the week with an exclusive live stream as well. So all the links to that will always be in the description box below for you to check out. Now, let's talk about why we are here today. As you guys can tell by the title of today's episode, we are talking about the yogurt shop murders. Now, this is a case that went cold for decades, and it was recently solved only in the past few months. When the news came out that this case had been solved, I was absolutely floored, considering that this has been a case that I had followed for quite some time. I know it's not one that we had ever spoken about on Killer Instinct, but I had always followed it, and I was always hoping that there would be justice one day. This is an absolutely horrifying case, so I'm very curious to hear your thoughts and opinions. So with that all being said, let's jump right on into it today. So to start off this case, I want to talk about our 4 victims. Firstly, I want to talk about Jennifer Harbison. She was born on May 9th, 1974 in Texarkana, Texas, to her parents, Barbara and Michael. And our second victim is her younger sister, Sarah Harbison, who was born on October 28th, 1976, also in Texarkana, Texas. Both girls attended Lanier High School and grew up in Austin, Texas. Now, our third victim is Amy Ayers, and she was born on January 31st, 1978, also in Austin. Amy grew up with a love of animals, particularly horses. She actually got her own cutting horse. She was gifted a cutting horse by her parents when she was 12 years old, and she was a part of the FFA, which stood for Future Farmers of America. Now, there were many kids who joined this group, and after school, they would go to the farm where they would learn all things farming, all things animals, and just everything related to that. And it was at the FFA where Amy met the Harbison sisters. Now, Amy loved anything that had to do with the outdoors. She loved fishing, she loved camping, she loved being outside. She was very knowledgeable, and she was known to have a gift pertaining to animals, and her parents actually actually described her as an old soul. Now, our fourth victim is Eliza Thomas. Eliza was born on May 16th, 1974 in Austin, Texas, to her parents Maria and James. She was an only child and raised in a very close and loving family. She also attended Lanier High School, where she shined socially, academically, and musically. She was a member of the band where she played the clarinet, and she also sang in the school choir. Her friends described her as being someone who was a little bit more on the shy side when she would first meet someone. However, once you got to know her, she was extremely loyal. Eliza also had a love for animals, particularly cats, and Eliza and Jennifer were actually the only two employees who worked at the frozen yogurt shop where this case took place, called I Can't Believe It's Yogurt. Now, this was a chain frozen yogurt shop that was founded in Dallas in 1977, and the Austin location was placed in a strip mall located at 2900 West Anderson Lane in Austin, Texas. So with that being said, we are going to jump to when this case took place, which was on Friday, December 6th of 1991. Now, this started out as a normal shift for Jennifer and Eliza, who were both scheduled that evening to work closing shifts. They were the only two scheduled to work the closing shift. This was something that they had done many times in the past. And while they were there at their closing shift in the late night hours of Friday, December 6th, Jennifer's younger sisters, Sarah and Amy, had gone by the frozen yogurt shop to hang out with Jennifer and Eliza and help them close up the shop for the night. So Sarah and Amy were hanging out together separately while Jennifer and Eliza were working at their closing shift. And then Sarah and Amy went to I Can't Believe It's Not Yogurt to hang out with Jennifer and Eliza, help them close up shop. Again, very routine and very normal. However, just before midnight, there was a police car that was driving through the area by chance when she noticed that there was a fire coming from I Can't Believe It's Yogurt. The fire was called in by the officer and fire trucks raced over to the scene to extinguish it. However, what they found left behind would change absolutely everything. Once the fire was extinguished, 4 bodies were discovered in I Can't Believe It's Yogurt. Those 4 bodies were Jennifer, Eliza, Sarah, and Amy. All 4 girls were found brutally murdered, and it had appeared that a fire had been started in order to cover up the scene and destroy any potential evidence that could have been left behind. Sarah, Eliza, and Jennifer's bodies were found stacked on top of each other, each with a single gunshot wound in the back of their head, shot execution style, and they were all bound and gagged by their own underwear. All of the girls had also been severely burned, obviously because of the fire. Now, Amy was found in a separate area of the shop. She was found about 13 feet away from the other girls. She was found with what was reported to be a sock-like cloth around her neck. She had been shot twice in her head, and Amy had been shot twice in the head. Now, Sarah, Eliza, and Jennifer, it was determined that they were all shot with a .22 caliber pistol. However, Amy was believed to have been shot with a .380 caliber pistol, and that gun was actually found in a drain inside of the yogurt shop. Now, regarding the investigation, there was a lot of evidence that was either washed away or burnt away because of this fire. And along with that, there was also a lot of firemen going in and out of the shop to extinguish the fire. So the crime scene was not processed as thoroughly as it should have been. And it also had a very good chance of being contaminated, and was contaminated because of the fire and because of the fact that there were so many people going in and out of the shop. However, the police did the best they could with the information that they had at the time. Now, the lead investigators on this case were Detective John Jones, who now is a retired police detective, as well as Mike Huckabee, who's another retired Austin detective. And just to give you an understanding of how intense this fire was and the lengths that had to go in order to be able to extinguish it, police claimed that when they arrived on the scene and were walking into the yogurt shop, water was up to their shins. shins. The water that had been used to extinguish the fire was up to their shins, so everything had been completely washed away. Police also learned that there was approximately $540 stolen out of the cash register in the shop, and this is also when they discovered that there were 2 guns that were involved in these murders. Now, immediately upon the discovery of the girls' bodies, police contacted the store manager, who was a young woman named Reese, to inform her of what happened. Now, when Reese heard of the news, she immediately raced over to the shop while the scene was still being processed, and she was actually the one who identified all 4 of the girls. Reese claimed that she wanted to be the one to do that rather than having the families have to see all 4 of the girls in the state that they were discovered in. She didn't want the families to see them like that, so she was the one who identified them. At the time of their murders, both Jennifer and Eliza were 17 years old, Sarah was 15 years old, and Amy was only 13 years old. Now, with Reese being at the yogurt shop, she was actually able to take a look around at what was left of the shop and be able to determine that the girls appeared that they were almost done with their closing duties. Many of the closing duties that they would do every night were already completed. Certain things had been put away, certain things were done, but there still were a few things left to do. And this pointed out a potential theory to authorities that this very well could have just been a robbery gone wrong. However, there really wasn't anywhere to turn pertaining to potential suspects. There was no surveillance cameras in or outside the shop, nothing that was leading them in the direction of a suspect, and police theorized that possibly whoever did this only assumed that there were going to be 2 people working. Maybe they were watching and stalking the yogurt shop and seeing that only Jennifer and Eliza were working. However, when they walked in, they didn't account for the fact that Amy and Sarah would also be inside. So police thought maybe the offender initially assumed that they would only be up against 2 people. However, it turned out when they walked in, it was 4 people, and the girls fought back and things went very sideways very quickly. Police thought that that was a very probable explanation and theory as to what had happened. However, with the brutality of these murders and the way that police discovered the girls' bodies, it still seemed that there was something missing. Now, a week after the yogurt shop murders, this is when a 16-year-old boy named Maurice Pierce comes into the investigation because it was discovered that on the night of the murders, Maurice was at the North Cross Mall in Austin, which is just about 2 blocks away from the yogurt shop. And when he was at the mall, he was seen walking around with a pistol in his waistband that was fully loaded, and he also had bullets in his pocket. Now, it was said that Maurice was not hiding the fact that he had a gun in his waistband, and given that police had publicly said that they were looking for a .22 caliber pistol, police were notified about Maurice. Tips were being called in that Maurice was freely walking around in the mall with this pistol in his waistband, and because of that, Maurice was arrested and brought down to the police station for an interview to be conducted. Now, the interview that was conducted, it was done by a detective named Hector Polanco, and Hector Polanco was very, very well respected. He had actually never had a murder case go unsolved, so he interviewed Maurice for several hours, and this was very promising for other detectives and when people heard that there was an arrest made and there was a potential suspect. Now, when Detective Polanco sat down with Maurice, he asked Maurice to recount the night of the murders. Where was he the night of the murders? And according to Maurice in his statement, he claimed that on Friday, December 6, 1991, he picked up his friend, 15-year-old Forrest Wellborn, at McCallum High School at approximately 4:10 p.m., and the two drove around for a while before going back to Maurice's house. Maurice said that when they got there, Forrest had asked Maurice to see his gun, and Maurice said that he typically kept his gun in the closet, and he also did not deny having a gun either. He was very open about the fact that he did own a gun and he normally kept it in his closet. Now, Maurice did take out the gun to show Forrest, and then the two of them got back into Maurice's car and they took the gun with them. Now, Maurice claimed that the gun was put in the glove box and the two drove to the mall. Maurice said that once they got to the mall, the two ended up splitting up because Maurice wanted to go inside to the mall to use the bathroom, and then they would meet back up at Maurice's car afterwards. Now, Maurice claimed that he didn't know what Forrest was doing during the time that he was in the bathroom in the mall. He claimed that they just completely split up and that they ended up making their way back to each other shortly after that. Now, Maurice claimed that when they got back to the car, Forrest told him, "I did something," but he never answered what it was. Maurice claimed that when Forrest came back to the car, he smelt like hairspray. And Maurice also went on to tell police that after they left the mall, they went to meet up with two other boys, 17-year-old Robert Springsteen and 17-year-old Michael Scott. Now, Maurice claimed the four of them drove around. They were drinking, they were smoking weed, they were listening to music, driving around the town in the car, before ultimately he dropped off Michael and Rob back at Rob's house. And then Forrest and Maurice went back to Maurice's home. I know I'm throwing a lot of names at you and it might get kind of confusing, but essentially what Maurice is saying is he's driving around with Forrest, they go to the mall, they split up. Maurice comes back to meet Forrest. Forrest says, "I did something," never says what. They then go pick up Robert and Michael. They're driving around together. They're having a fun Friday night, nothing out of the ordinary. And then Robert and Michael get dropped back off at their home, and Forrest and Maurice go back to Maurice's home, where Maurice claims that they slept before they woke up and Forrest went back to his own home. Now, Maurice claimed that several hours later, Forrest returned back to Maurice's house unannounced this time and asked to borrow Maurice's gun because, according to Maurice, Forrest claimed he wanted to do what he did last night, go kill some more girls. That is, according to Maurice, what Forrest said. Now, I do want to point out that this is a little bit contradictory to what witnesses claim to see in the mall, because the whole reason that Maurice was brought up in the first place is because witnesses at the malls claimed that they saw Maurice walking around with a pistol in his waistband, waving it around, and just openly showing that he had a gun. However, according to Maurice, that was not the case, and that Forrest took the gun. So there are conflicting stories going on here. However, with this information, police wanted to see if Maurice would be able to get a confession out of Forrest. If what Maurice was saying was true, they wanted to mic him up and get a confession. So that's exactly what they did. Maurice agreed to do it. They wired him up and had him set up a meeting with Forrest. And during this meeting, Forrest did admit that he made comments about murdering the girls, but he claimed that he was only joking around. So he denied actually having any involvement. He just said that he did say it, but he was only kidding. Now, after this meeting, homicide detectives did also interview Forrest. However, from their perspective, they didn't believe that Forrest had the mental capability to pull off a quadruple homicide and get away with it. Essentially, they didn't believe that he was smart enough to do it. So along with that, there was also no other concrete evidence to point to Forrest other than what Maurice had said. So you have Forrest himself denying it, police not believing that Forrest would actually be capable of doing something like this, and no physical evidence at all. So because of that, they had to move on in their investigation, and police were still very determined to solve this case. Police sent undercover detectives to the funerals of all four of the girls to see if anyone would show up and confess to the murders. They also called every customer at the yogurt shop multiple times to see if they knew anything. Police even went to the extent of hiring a hypnotist to have the hypnotist hypnotize all the employees who worked at the yogurt shop to see if it could jog their memory on any suspicious customers that they had. However, nothing was working. Now, interestingly enough, in this case, there were multiple people who came forward and confessed to this, and we have seen this behavior in previous cases that we have covered as well, where people will come forward and confess to murders that they did not commit. There were many people who were in prison at the time, people who were incarcerated, who were coming forward and claiming that they were responsible for this. However, there was no evidence tying them to these murders whatsoever. Now, there was also something that came up in this case that really changed the course of the investigation, and that revolved around that detective that I previously mentioned mentioned named Hector Polanco. Now, like I mentioned, this was the very well-respected detective who had never had a murder case go unsolved. But it was reported and revealed that he had been coercing people, allegedly, into confessing murders. Now, Detective John Jones and Detective Mike Huckabee, who were working on this case at the time, have both gone on record stating that Polanco was known for scaring people into confessing. If that's what he wanted to do, he would pull every trick out of the book to try and get someone to confess, even if it was not the killer themselves. It had been revealed that Polanco had allegedly done this in cases in the past, and it had also been revealed that he was doing this with potential suspects involved in the yogurt shop murders, potential suspects that police were looking into at the time. There were multiple people that Detective Polanco had interviewed that had confessed to these murders. However, when Detective Jones and Huckabee looked at the transcripts and looked at all the details of this, they found that there were several details about the case that were wrong or that were missing from these potential or suspected persons of interest. So because of that, Jones and Huckabee knew that these confessions were not accurate, and this ended up being so much of an issue that in March of 1992, Detective Polanco had been reassigned due to the allegations of coercion that he had against him. And this was a very big deal in general, however, even more so because at the time, Detective Polanco was the senior supervisor on the task force. And even though this felt like a setback in the investigation, the detectives that were still working on this case were motivated to solve it. And as months passed, police were very much struggling trying to decipher through all of the tips that they were receiving. They were getting thousands and thousands of tips, and they were trying to go through each and every one of them. And they had actually upped the reward to $100,000 for anyone who was able to provide credible information to them pertaining to the case. And this led to an even more influx of tips that were almost hard to go through. It was hard to go through all of them. And police were hearing every theory under the sun from these tips. They were hearing that the murders were the result of a satanic white supremacist cult, that this was a robbery gone wrong, that it was one person or multiple people or this person or that person. The detectives felt like the tips were really endless. And then in October of 1992, so 10 months after the murders, there was a new confession and police announced an arrest. Sometimes the scariest unsolved cases can happen in your own mind, like being tormented by disturbing thoughts you don't want, can't control, and can't stop replaying. I'm talking about thoughts like, what if I notice someone else? I'm terrified I'm going to cheat on my partner and ruin everything. Or that memory feels fuzzy. Did I make it up? What if I did something terrible and forgot about it? These thoughts can feel so real and so threatening that you actually start behaving in life-altering ways just because you're so desperate to make the distress go away and calm your mind. You might start avoiding the people that you love the most, spend hours every day trying to figure out why you're having these thoughts, or seek reassurance from everyone that you're not a bad person. If this sounds familiar to you, then you might be experiencing OCD, and you're not alone because I have it too. It's more common than you might think, but it's also one of the most misunderstood mental health conditions out there. Real OCD is nothing like the stereotypes about liking things organized. It's a serious and highly misunderstood condition where unwanted, distressing thoughts get stuck on repeat in your mind, and you feel compelled to engage in certain behaviors to try and make them stop. These unwanted thoughts are called intrusive thoughts. They're often disturbing or taboo and feel totally out of character. They can be about anything, but often focus on the people or things that we care about, like our relationships, identity, or our health, making it extremely hard to ignore. People with OCD often feel driven to do certain mental or physical behaviors like replaying past events, following very specific routines, or avoiding certain people or certain situations to cope with the anxiety caused by their thoughts. But the amazing thing is, OCD is highly treatable with the right kind of specialized therapy. What works for OCD is is ERP therapy, or exposure and response prevention. So not standard talk therapy, which can make things worse. NoCD is the world's leading provider of OCD treatment. All of their licensed therapists truly understand OCD and specialize in treating with ERP. NoCD therapists are trained by world-renowned experts in OCD, so they know how to help you take the power away from intrusive thoughts and live the life you want to live. Therapy with NoCD is 100% virtual, covered by insurance for over 155 million Americans, and includes support between sessions, so you're never facing OCD alone. To learn more about starting OCD therapy with NoCD, go to nocd.com and book a free call to learn more about how they can help. That's nocd.com. Let's face it, we're all busy, and the last thing that you want to do at the end of a busy week is stress about what your next weekly food shopping is going to look like, what meals you're going to have, is everyone going to like them, how long is it going to take? But luckily with Hungryroot, you don't have to worry about that anymore. Hungryroot plans all of my meals for the week, shops for me, and delivers everything I need that fits my health goals, dietary preferences, and budget. Hungryroot helps you eat well and reach your diet or health goals, whether you're gluten-free, dairy-free, high protein, if you're focused on your gut health, or anything else. Just take a quick quiz, and their smart cart technology recommends recipes and ingredients tailored to your tastes and needs. Unlike other food delivery companies, Hungryroot has over 15,000 chef-crafted recipes to choose from each and every week, with many of them being ready in just 15 minutes or less. And with that much variety, it is easy to find options that fit everyone's taste and nutrition goals. Hungryroot holds all of its food to very high standards, screening out over 200 additives, including high fructose corn syrup, artificial sweeteners, and preservatives. They source only high-quality meat and seafood with no hormones or antibiotics. They offer organic produce and non-GMO options, and carry trusted healthy brands like Oatly, Vital Farms, Ithaca Hummus, Harmless Harvest, and many more. I have been talking to you guys about Hungryroot for quite some time now, and I mean when I say they truly have been such a game changer in my life and my stress levels. Not only are they taking the stress off of meal planning and taking something off of my plate each week, they're also helping me physically put something on my plate each and every day. I could not thank Hungryroot enough. I know for my husband and I, it is a little bit difficult to try and find something that we both love day after day, because I hate to admit it, I am a little bit more of the picky eater out of the two of us. However, Hungryroot has taken away all that stress, and I feel so much better knowing that we are both going to get things that we love from our Hungryroot order, and the meals that we make take no time at all. So take advantage of this exclusive offer, and for a limited time, get 40% off your first box, plus get a free item in every box for life. Go to hungryroot.com/killer and use code KILLER. That's hungryroot.com/killer, code KILLER, to get 40% off your first box and a free item of your choice for life. But then things took another turn. In October of 1992, so 10 months after the murders, there was a new confession and police announced an arrest. There was a 23-year-old man named Porfirio Saavedra who was known as the Terminator. And it was alleged that he confessed that he and his friend, 28-year-old Alberto Cortez, were responsible for the killings. Now, both of these men were arrested in Mexico for a separate crime. However, the men did confess to the yogurt shop murders as well, which was confusing to authorities for many reasons. And when Jones and Huckabee got a copy of their written confession, they knew pretty quickly that these men could not be responsible, and that, again, this was just another false confession. There were several facts that both of these men had wrong in the case, such as the caliber of the gun that was used. And shortly after this, it was revealed that the men claimed that they were threatened into confessing to the murder. So they had absolutely nothing to do with it. And the investigation yet again had to continue on, because ultimately these were not the men that were responsible. But at this point, police were struggling. After about almost a year into this investigation, tips started to slow down and police did not know where to turn. So the case went cold for several years and it was really at a standstill. But in 1997, a new team of investigators took over the case and reopened it. The new lead investigator on this case was a man named Paul Johnson. Now, this was a hard transition for the previous detectives, Jones and Huckabee, who believed that when Johnson took over the case, that they would still be involved to some degree. However, that was not necessarily true from their standpoint. Now, when Johnson first took a look at the case and what detectives had, he, as well as the other new team of investigators, very much believed that Maurice Pierce and his friends, Forrest, Michael, and Robert, all seemed like very, very credible suspects. Now remember, they had been previously put on standby because detectives did not have enough evidence against them at the time. But the new investigators felt like there were still a lot of unanswered questions. They felt like there was inconsistencies in Maurice's story that caused them to want to take a closer look at these four men again. Now they ended up bringing Robert Springsteen back in for an interrogation. And while he initially denied having any involvement, after hours and hours of questioning, he actually began questioning his own denial. Robert did. Robert started second guessing himself. And what started off as him saying that he was never at the yogurt shop at all turned into him actually saying that he was there and that so was Maurice and so was Michael and so was Forrest, and that he himself saw Maurice with a gun in his hand. So the two stories are drastically changing. And not only did Robert himself change his story, but now none of the four men had consistent stories. Every single one of them had a different account of what happened that night, and also none of their alibis were checking out. Now, granted, this was years and years and years down the road, but the inconsistencies only made police further suspicious. Now, it's also important to point out that there is no record of what the boys had initially said in their 1991 interrogations with Detective Hector Polanco. And because of that, it really is hard to decipher what they were told back then and if there was any information that was overlapping, any inconsistencies, any consistencies, because we don't know what they said in 1991. Now, according to Paul Johnson, the new lead investigator who took over, he claimed that during his interrogations with Robert and Michael, they were free to leave at any time, and he made sure that the men knew that. He told the men that they were not under arrest and could leave at any moment. However, according to him, they chose not to, and instead, these interviews lasted for hours, so much so that both men were now placing themselves at the scene of the crime. Like I said, they were initially saying that they weren't there at all, and then changing their story entirely to say that they were responsible for it. So there was very drastic differences. Now, I do want to mention, if you are to go and watch these interrogations and watch the questioning, it is very clear that there is coercion going on, but the men never walked out of the interviews. They never got up and they never walked out. And instead, they're being hammered with questions. They're being guided in their interrogations, and they're beginning to question themselves. They're questioning themselves, questioning if they blacked out these memories, questioning, where they were that night. And they're actually, you hear them telling themselves, I must have forgotten this. I didn't think I was there, but maybe I was. And despite only two of them confessing, both Michael and Robert, and no other evidence tying them to the crimes, mind you, there was no other evidence, all four were arrested. So Forrest, Maurice, Michael, and Robert were all arrested on October 6th, 1999. Now, on December 9th of 1999, the judge ruled that they were going to try Maurice and Forrest as adults, despite only being 15 and 16 years old at the time of the murders. Now, a few days later, on December 14th, Robert was indicted by the Travis County Grand Jury on 4 counts of capital murder, and it was announced that the state would be seeking out the death penalty against Robert. Now, again, a few days later, on December 18th, the grand jury indicted Michael on 4 counts of capital murder, and they too would be seeking out the death penalty against Michael. However, they were not going to be seeking out the death penalty against Maurice. But several months later, things changed when Forrest was actually released after the grand jury refused to indict him. So the capital murder charges were dismissed against Forrest. However, the other 3 men remained in prison and were heading to trial. Robert's trial began in April of 2001, and by June of 2001, Robert was found guilty and sentenced to death for all 4 murders. Now, this was surprising for a multitude of reasons. The first one being there was no evidence. There was no concrete physical evidence that tied Robert to the crime other than his confession, which was enough for him to get a conviction. Now, the prosecution went into great detail during this case about the brutality of the murders, and when you pair that with someone who at a certain point was admitting guilt, the jury found him guilty. Now, in September of 2002, Michael was also convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the murders, and several months later in January, Maurice's charges were actually dismissed and he was released. Now, this was shocking because up until this point, it definitely did seem like Maurice was the ringleader. Even in Robert's confession, he stated that he saw Maurice with a gun in his hand in the yogurt shop, and that's who he kind of pinpointed as the leader of this group of 4. So it was shocking that Maurice was now being let go and released of his charges. Now, several years later, in 2005, Robert had the opportunity to have his sentence reduced from the death penalty to life in prison. However, both verdicts were overturned on an appeal after the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that the men's rights, both Robert and Michael's, had been violated when portions of one man's confession were used against the other. Now, this was a very, very pivotal point in this entire investigation and for both of these men as well, because for the prosecution, they started planning new trials because they were going to try both of these men again. However, because it had been years later and there were some advancements in DNA technology, it was revealed that the male genetic material that was found at the crime scene was not a match to neither Michael nor Robert. Now, I want to mention this because this is so incredibly crucial. The fact that there was DNA, male DNA found at the crime scene, and they did not have the advancements at the time in DNA technology to be able to tie it to Michael or Robert one way or another, but now they did, and the DNA was showing that it was not a match to neither Michael nor Robert. So there was no new trial that was going to be taken place. Both men were released from the Travis County Jail on June 24th, 2009. So even years and years later, both Michael and Robert were released from the Travis County Jail on bond after nearly a decade in prison. Now, later that same year, the prosecutors formally dismissed all the charges against Robert and Michael, citing the unresolved DNA evidence and the inability to link the men conclusively to the murders. And not just Michael and Robert, by the way. This also meant the same thing for Maurice and Forrest. Now, this meant that the yogurt shop murders were back to being unsolved. And while this meant that the 4 men were no longer in prison for a crime that they did not commit, there was still a devastating feeling for these families of these victims and of these young girls who now had to live with the fact that the case was still unsolved. It was just devastating all around. It was horrible for these young men who had to spend a decade of their life in prison and had been looked at for this murder for almost 2 decades. And it was also just devastating for the families as well. It was horrible all around. So this now brings us to February of 2022. So over 3 decades after the murders, and it was announced that there was a new investigative team that was taking over the cold case of the yogurt shop murders. After all 4 men had been released, there really was no progress in this investigation until 2022. And in 2022, it was announced that they were going to use the advancements in DNA technology yet again to try and solve this case. And with the case being over 30 years old at this time. There had been plenty of advancements in DNA technology since then, and in doing so, police were actually able to uncover the real killer, and it was no one that they had expected. Now, when police initially canvassed the crime scene on December 6th of 1991, they recovered male DNA from the scene, even though there was a lot at the scene that was damaged, washed away, burned away. They were able to recover male DNA from the girls' bodies. Now, for years, the police had been matching that DNA to any potential suspects to see if it was a positive match. However, as we know, none of them were. Police knew that this unknown DNA was going to be the key to solving this case. So in the recent years, with the updates of technology, police submitted that DNA into genealogy, which is something that we have seen many times being really the missing puzzle piece to solving a lot of these unsolved cold cases. And that's exactly what happened here. When they submitted the DNA, it led them to a family tree that connected them to a man named Robert Eugene Brashers. Robert Brashers was a convicted rapist and murderer who had actually died by suicide in a police standoff in Missouri in 1999. Now, because Robert had already died, police obtained DNA from his relatives and used a system called YSTR testing, which analyzes the Y chromosome passed through the paternal line of DNA. And when they compared that to the DNA that they recovered at the yogurt shop, the odds were estimated to be millions to 1, meaning Robert was their killer. But not only that, the ballistics from the .380 pistol was also a match to a separate murder in Kentucky that had been previously connected to Robert. So the gun that was used in the yogurt shop murders, Robert had used previously in a different murder case. So who is Robert Brashers? Robert Eugene Brashers was born on March 13th, 1958 in Newport News, Virginia. He spent the majority of his childhood in Huntsville, Alabama, and he served in the military after high school before going on to work some odd jobs here and there. But behind closed doors, he was living a double life as a serial rapist and murderer. Now, what started with break-ins and robberies and assaults escalated to rape and murder. Known murders connected to Robert were the Scherer murders, which took place in March of 1998, where he murdered 38-year-old Sherry Scherer and her 12-year-old daughter Megan. He was also tied to a 1990s murder in Kentucky that I had mentioned previously, and he is assumed to be tied to multiple assaults all throughout the South in the 90s as well. And with this discovery, police have solved the yogurt shop murders. After 3 decades of not having answers, this case was finally solved. Now, I know we still don't have a lot of answers. Because of the fact that Robert has died, it definitely leaves with more questions than answers. And it definitely brings a level of frustration when you discover that Robert has been dead for well over 20 years at this point. And at the time that he had died, all 4 of the other men, meaning Maurice, Forrest, Michael, and Robert, they were being arrested for this crime itself, for a crime that Robert committed. These 4 men were being arrested and charged with these murders for crimes, brutal crimes that they did not commit. Meanwhile, Robert was in a standoff with authorities and ending his own life. And these men, these other 4 men, had to go on, be in prison, and be accused for crimes that they did not commit. And even though we can finally say that the yogurt shop murders have been solved and these families can have a sense of closure as to what exactly happened, it only leaves room for an endless amount of questions. What was Robert doing that night? Why did he target the yogurt shop itself? Had he been a customer before? Was he stalking these girls? These are the questions that we just don't know. Now, I do want to point out pertaining to Detective John Jones, he wore a green and white striped shirt on the night that the murders took place. And there's a reason that this is important, because when he wore the shirt on the night of the murders, he was seen in the media, he was talking to the families, and he told the families that the only time that he was going to wear that shirt again was when the case was solved. And Years and years later, decades and decades later, John Jones kept his promise, and he was able to wear that same shirt after the case had been solved. He told the families then, and he kept his promise all the way up until this case was solved. He told the families that the next time they saw him in that shirt, it would be when the case was solved, and that is exactly what he did. And I personally believe that Detective John Jones and Detective Mike Huckabee and everyone on the investigators team pertaining to this case, no matter when they worked on it. However, I think specifically Detective John Jones and Mike Huckabee just deserve so much praise for the amount of effort that they put into this case. They really were meticulous about the details and making sure that they were getting the right person and not just pinning these murders on the easier targets, so it seemed. They never believed that the 4 other victims were responsible for these murders, and they went back and went over everything, and they tried their best to stay as involved in the case as possible, and they preserved as much evidence as they possibly could from the crime scene, which was incredibly hard to do considering that things had been damaged by either the fire or water, but they did their best to preserve, again, that male DNA and any other evidence that was left behind. They preserved it for years and years and years, which is ultimately what led to the solving of this case. So that, you guys, is the yogurt shop murders. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts and opinions about it, so please let me know in the comments below. But with that being said, you guys, it's going to be all for me today. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Killer Instinct. Again, if you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah and I am your host. Make sure you go ahead, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. That way you never miss an episode. We post weekly here on the podcast every single Wednesday. You're not going to want to miss it. We also post on YouTube on Wednesdays as well. Make sure you're subscribed. All the links for Patreon will be in the description box below. I will be back next week for a brand new one. And until then, stay safe. Bye, guys.